Vienna, December 8, 1791, 3 days after the death of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. The apartment on Rauhensteingasse smelled of tallow candles and grief. Cold seeped through the windows. In the next room, 2 small boys wiped, the older one 7 years old, the younger just 4 months, too young to understand why his father would never hold him again. Constanze Mozart sat alone amid the chaos. She was 29 years old, a widow. Unpaid bills covered every surface like fallen leaves. Creditors knocked at the door every hour, their patience exhausted, their claims legitimate. But she heard none of it. Before her sat a wooden chest filled with her husband's correspondence. Hundreds of letters, written to his father, his mother, his sister, written to friends, patrons, creditors, written to a cousin whose name would later make scholars blush. Written to her. She unfolded the first sheet. Read it. Her hands began to tremble. Then the next, and the next. By morning, the fireplace held nothing but ash. We do not know what Constanze found that night. Scholars have debated it for 2 centuries. What we know with certainty is this. She destroyed a significant portion of her husband's correspondence. Forever, deliberately, compliantly. What could have been so terrible, so scandalous, so dangerous that a young widow, desperately needing money, surrounded by creditors, responsible for 2 small children, would choose to burn those pages rather than sell them to collectors who would have paid handsomely? This is not a story about how Mozart died. That question has been examined and theorized until it has lost all meaning. The mystery of his death has overshadowed something far more interesting. This is a story about what he hid while he was alive. The correspondence that survived, the pages Constanze spared, shocked researchers for 200 years. Messages filled with crude jokes about bodily functions. Explicit romantic fantasies sent to a young cousin. Bitter arguments with his father. Paranoid accusations against colleagues. Confessions of complete financial ruin despite earning what should have been a fortune. And this was only what she chose to spare. In the hours ahead, you will meet Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart as he has rarely been presented. Not the marble statue of concert hall mythology. Not the divine child touched by heaven. You will meet a man who could compose an aria of heartbreaking beauty in the morning and send his mother a rhyme about defecation in the afternoon. A man whose tenderness was inseparable from his vulgarity, whose brilliance was inseparable from his chaos. But to understand who he became, we must first see who made him. We must begin with a man who looked at his 3-year-old son and saw not a child, but a commodity. Leopold Mozart was 47 years old when his son was born on January 27, 1756. He had spent his entire adult life as a court musician in Salzburg, a small principality ruled by an archbishop. It was respectable employment. It was also a prison. Salzburg in the middle of the 18th century was not Vienna. It was not Paris or London. It was a provincial backwater, beautiful but suffocating, where talented men went to see their ambitions slowly strangled. Leopold had published a treatise on violin playing that earned him modest recognition. He composed pieces that were performed and then forgotten. He taught lessons to aristocratic children who would never remember his name. He was a man who knew exactly how good he was, and knew equally well that the world would never give him what he deserved. Then his 7th child was born, the second to survive infancy. a boy. Leopold and his wife Anna Maria had already raised one prodigy. Their daughter Nanel, 4.5 years older than Wolfgang, showed exceptional musical talent from an early age. Leopold had begun teaching her harpsichord before she could read. She learned quickly. She performed well. But she was a girl. In 18th century Europe, girls did not become professional musicians. They did not turn courts and concert halls. They married and disappeared into domesticity. Nannerl's talent was charming. It was not a career. Wolfgang was different. Wolfgang was male, and Wolfgang was something Leopold had never encountered. The moment of discovery has been told so often it has calcified into legend. At 3 years old, the boy began picking out thrills on the harpsichord, not randomly striking keys, selecting harmonious intervals as if he understood them. At 4, he started learning short pieces, memorizing them after a single demonstration. At 5, he was composing. Leopold kept meticulous records. He noted every piece his son learned, every composition the child produced, every gulden earned from their performances. The account books survive. They tell us something important. He was not merely a proud father. He was a businessman assessing an investment. There is a detail from Wolfgang's early childhood that appears in multiple accounts. The boy would climb onto his father's lap after lessons, demanding kisses and affection. He would ask Leopold repeatedly whether his father loved him. Leopold would say yes. Then the child would ask again and again, "Do you love me, Papa?" "Yes, Wolfgang, I love you." "Really? Truly?" "Yes." "Now go practice." A child who sensed, even at that tender age, that love in his family came with conditions, that affection was tied to performance, that being loved and being useful were somehow the same thing. The little boy was energetic beyond reason. He jumped on tables. He made cat noises. He invented pranks and games and private languages with his sister. He seemed to vibrate with an energy that could not be contained. Leopold channeled all of it. Every ounce of that restless spirit was directed toward the keyboard, toward the violin, toward composition, toward performing. By the time Wolfgang was 6 years old, he had given his first public performance. By 7, he was on tour. But the tours were only the beginning. The great European expedition began in 1763 and did not end until 1766. 3.5 years on the road. The boy was 7 when it started. He was 10 when it ended. Consider what this meant. A child younger than most second graders today, traveling by carriage across roads that were often little more than muddy tracks, sleeping in unfamiliar beds in unfamiliar cities, performing night after night for audiences who saw him not as a person, but as a curiosity, a train marvel, a freak of nature in powdered wig and silk stockings. Leopold brought the whole family. Anna Maria came, though she had little say in the matter. Nannerl came too. She was still part of the act in those early years, the talented sister who made the brother's abilities seem even more miraculous by comparison. They traveled to Munich, to Vienna, to Paris, to London, to Holland, to Switzerland. They performed for emperors and empresses, kings and queens, dukes and duchesses, and countless lesser nobles who paid good money to see the wonder child. The performances themselves were circus acts. Wolfgang played with his eyes blindfolded. He played with the keyboard covered by cloth so he could not see the keys. He improvised on themes suggested by the audience. He identified the pitch of any sound, a bell, a sneeze, a door closing, with perfect accuracy, and Leopold stood in the wings, watching, counting, calculating. He systematically lied about his son's age on promotional materials. If Wolfgang was 7, the advertisement said 6. If he was 8, they said 7. A younger prodigy was more impressive. A younger prodigy commanded higher fees. The children fell ill repeatedly. Smallpox, typhoid, mysterious fevers that doctors could not diagnose. Wolfgang nearly died more than once. But as soon as he recovered, the tours resumed. There was money to be made. There was a future to secure. What does this do to a child? Wolfgang never learned to manage money. His father handled every financial transaction. He became addicted to applause, to attention, to the validation of strangers. He formed a sense that he was only valuable when he was producing something extraordinary. But perhaps the most telling moment came when he was 14, in Rome, in the year 1770. In the Sistine Chapel, there existed a piece called the Miserere by Gregorio Allegri. It was a 9-voice composition of extraordinary complexity, performed only during Holy Week. The Vatican guarded it jealously. Copying the score was forbidden. Taking the music outside the chapel walls was punishable by excommunication. Wolfgang attended a performance. He listened once. Then he went back to his lodgings and wrote out the entire piece from memory. 9 voices. After a single hearing, Leopold was terrified and elated. He wrote home to his wife with instructions to tell no one. Their son had committed an act of intellectual piracy against the most powerful religious institution in the world. He wrote down the whole thing, Leopold reported, after hearing it just once. When Wolfgang was asked about it later, his response was simple. I just wrote down what I heard. But it is forbidden. The music did not do anything wrong. Why should it be hidden? This was the boy Leopold Mozart had created, brilliant beyond measure, and increasingly aware that rules apply to other people. While father and son conquered Europe, someone remained behind. A woman whom history has largely forgotten. A woman who bore 7 children and buried 5 of them. Anna Maria Mozart was warm, affectionate, and possessed of the same crude sense of humor that would later shock readers of her son's correspondence. Yes, the famous vulgarity was not Wolfgang's invention. It was a family trait. Anna Maria wrote letters filled with jokes about bodily functions, playful obscenities, and earthy humor. The apple did not fall far from the tree. But Anna Maria had no power in her own home. Leopold made the decisions. Leopold controlled the money. She was a supporting character in her own life. In 1777, Leopold made a fateful decision. Wolfgang was 22, too old to be a child prodigy, not yet established as an adult composer. He needed to find a position, a patron, a path forward. Leopold could not accompany him. His duties in Salzburg would not allow a lengthy absence. So he sent Anna Maria instead. She was 57 years old. She had not traveled extensively in years. But Leopold needed someone to watch over his son, to prevent him from making foolish decisions about money or women. Mother and son traveled to Munich, to Mannheim, and finally to Paris. The trip was a disaster. No position materialized. No patron appeared. The money ran out. And in the summer of 1778, Anna Maria fell ill. The room where she lay dying smelled of sickness and tallow candles. Outside, Paris continued its indifferent noise. Carriages, vendors, the endless clatter of a city that did not know or care that Anna Maria Mozart was slipping away. She died on July 3rd, with only her son at her bedside. What Wolfgang did next has puzzled biographers ever since. He did not immediately inform his father. Instead, he wrote a letter saying that his mother was very ill and that they should prepare for bad news. Only days later did he send the truth. "I hope you are prepared to hear a sad and painful piece of news," he wrote. "My dear, beloved mother is no longer with us. God has called her to himself." Was this emotional numbness? Shock? Or was his fear of Leopold's anger stronger than his grief? We cannot know, but Leopold blamed his son for the tragedy. In letters that followed, grief mixed with accusation. Why had Wolfgang not called a doctor sooner? Why had he failed to protect her? The relationship between father and son never fully recovered. But Anna Maria was not the only victim of the Mozart family's ambitions. Maria Anna Mozart, called Nannerl by everyone who knew her, was born on July 30th, 1751. She was 4.5 years older than Wolfgang, and in her childhood she was considered every bit as talented. She performed with Wolfgang across Europe. The promotional materials featured both of them, the wonder children of Salzburg. She played harpsichord with skill and sensitivity. Critics and patrons were impressed. Then she turned 18, and her career ended. It was not dramatic. There was no announcement. It simply became understood that Nannerl would no longer perform professionally. She was a woman now, of marriageable age. Her talent was no longer relevant. Leopold stopped investing in her development. Every lesson, every opportunity, every journey was for the son. The daughter was expected to wait quietly until a suitable match could be arranged. The siblings had been close in childhood. They invented private languages together, shared jokes and secrets. But as Wolfgang's career ascended and Nannerl's withered, something changed. The warmth cooled. By the time Wolfgang married, the relationship had practically ended. Nannerl's own romantic hopes were crushed by Leopold. She fell in love with a man named Franz Leopold, a captain, apparently respectable. Leopold forbade the match. Not good enough. Not promising enough. At 33, she was married off to a 50-year-old widower with 5 children. Johann Baptist von Berchtold zu Sonnenberg needed a wife to manage his household. Nannerl needed, in Leopold's view, a husband before she became too old to attract one. Wolfgang did not attend her wedding. The last time the siblings saw each other was in 1783. Wolfgang brought his new wife, Constanze. The visit was tense, the atmosphere icy. They exchanged polite words and little else. They would never meet again. When Wolfgang died in December of 1791, Nannerl's reaction went unrecorded. She had not seen her brother in 8 years. She had not written to him in months. Whether she wept, whether she felt release, whether she mourned the boy she had once performed beside or resented the man who had overshadowed her, we do not know. She lived another 38 years. She helped shape his posthumous legend, but on her own terms. She shared some memories with biographers. She withheld others. She destroyed correspondence, as Constanze had done. What was she hiding? What did she carry to her grave? The silence speaks as loudly as her brother's music. And speaking of things hidden, If you had read the private correspondence Wolfgang sent to his cousin in 1777, you would understand why some things needed to remain secret. Welcome to the part of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's life that respectable biographers preferred to ignore. When 19th century scholars first examined the complete correspondence, they encountered a problem they had not anticipated. The writings were brilliant, insightful, often moving, and frequently unprintable. The first published collections simply removed the offensive passages. Editors replaced them with ellipses or vague notes indicating that certain material was unsuitable for publication. Victorian sensibilities could not accommodate what the divine composer had actually written. It was not until the 20th century that readers saw the full truth, and the truth was startling. Consider a message the young man sent to his mother in 1777. He was 21 years old, traveling through Germany. He concluded his correspondence with these words, "Good night. Poo in your bed and make it burst." This was not isolated. It was not a momentary lapse. It was typical. To his cousin Maria Anna Thekla, known affectionately as Ball, he wrote messages that would make a sailor wince. "Well, I wish you good night, but first poop in your bed and make it burst. Sleep soundly, my love, stretch your behind to your mouth." To his wife Constanze, years later, he wrote with similar earthiness about matters that proper society pretended did not exist. Early researchers proposed medical explanations. Perhaps Mozart suffered from Tourette syndrome, a neurological condition causing involuntary obscene outbursts. The theory gained traction for a time, but this theory has been largely abandoned. The crude humor was not involuntary. It was deliberate, playful, entirely under control. He crafted elaborate jokes requiring thought and effort. This was not a symptom. It was a choice. The more convincing explanation lies in cultural context. The German-speaking world of the 18th century had a robust tradition of such humor. The figure of Hanswurst, a crude clown in popular theater, delighted audiences with precisely these jokes. Peasant folklore was filled with earthy references. Even educated people engaged in humor that later generations would find shocking. Moreover, this was a family trait. Anna Maria wrote similar content. The jokes were inherited, part of the family's private language. What the correspondence reveals is not mental illness, but authenticity. In his public life, Wolfgang was forced to perform, to be the divine child, the court musician, the obedient servant. In private correspondence, he allowed himself to be human, to be silly, to be crude, to be everything the powdered wigs were designed to hide. The same hand that wrote sublime piano concertos also wrote jokes about defecation. This was not contradiction. This was completeness. Among the most intriguing recipients was his cousin Maria Anna Thekla, 2 years his junior, whom he met in Augsburg in 1777. The correspondence he sent her was among the most explicit he ever wrote. Were they lovers? The question has never been answered. Some historians argue the writings were merely literary games, transgressive humor between cousins. Others point to meetings without chaperones and intimacy, suggesting something more. A tantalizing detail adds fuel to speculation. In 1784, Ball gave birth to an illegitimate daughter. The official father was listed as a priest. The timing allows for other possibilities. Maria Anna Thekla Mozart lived until 1841. She never married. The daughter born in 1784 was raised quietly. Ball never spoke publicly about her famous cousin. Whatever passed between them remained her secret to the end. The answer died with her. The vulgarity was not confined to private correspondence. It found its way into the music itself. Among the compositions that scholars rarely discuss in polite company is a canon designated K. 231 in the catalogue of Mozart's works. Its title, when translated from German, means "lick me in the behind." It was written for 6 voices and intended to be sung by friends after dinner, with wine as entertainment. For many years, scholars assumed this must be a forgery. The divine creator of Don Giovanni could not possibly have written something so vulgar. It defied belief, but authentication proved otherwise. The manuscript is genuine, the handwriting is his, the composition is his, and it was not unique. Another canon bears a title even more explicit. A third piece, called Bona Nox, presents itself as a lullaby, but contains lyrics about bodily functions that would be inappropriate in any nursery. Perhaps the cleverest of these compositions appears to be a setting of Latin text, difficile lectum mihi Mars, sung aloud by German speakers with German pronunciation. The Latin syllables transform into something quite different, the same crude phrase that appeared in the other canons. It was a linguistic joke, a pun across languages, the kind of wordplay that requires genuine wit to conceive. These pieces were never intended for public performance. They were private entertainment, created for close friends, sung at gatherings where propriety was temporarily suspended. They tell us that his social circle included people who appreciated this kind of humor. More importantly, they remind us that the separation between serious art and low entertainment is artificial. The same creative intelligence produced both the requiem and songs about excrement. The talent was indivisible. In 1784, Wolfgang acquired an unusual pet. He was walking through Vienna when he passed a shop selling birds. In the window sat a starling, and the starling was singing. What caught his attention was not merely the song, but its content. The bird was whistling a theme from his Piano Concerto No. 17, a piece he had recently completed. The melody was recognizable, undeniable. There was only one problem. The bird had one note wrong. Wolfgang bought the starling immediately. The price was 34 kreutzer, which he recorded in his expense book with a note. That was beautiful. For 3 years, the bird lived in his household. It sang. It mimicked. It presumably continued performing its slightly incorrect version of the concerto. In 1787, the bird died. What Wolfgang did next astonished everyone who knew him. He organized a funeral, a genuine funeral, with a procession, with mourners dressed in black, with a ceremony at the grave. He wrote an elegy in verse for the occasion. Here lies a cherished creature. The poem began, a starling bird, still in the prime of life. He had to experience death's bitter sting. The same man who wrote crude jokes, who seemed at times to care for nothing but his own amusement, this man held a funeral for a bird. The apparent contradiction reveals emotional range, not inconsistency. A person who could grieve for a starling was not less human for his vulgar jokes. He was more human. He contained multitudes. But whatever his eccentricities, there was one thing Wolfgang did with absolute consistency. He fell in love. Passionately, completely, and often inconveniently. The first great love of his life was Aloysia Weber. He met her in Mannheim in 1777. He was 21 years old, still traveling with his mother, still searching for the position that would establish his adult career. Aloysia was 17, a singer of exceptional promise, beautiful in a way that made young men foolish. Wolfgang became foolish immediately. Within weeks, he was writing to his father with plans that Leopold found alarming. He wanted to take Aloysia to Italy. He wanted to write operas for her voice. He wanted to marry her. She sings magnificently, he wrote home. She has a beautiful, pure voice. I love her, and she loves me. I swear on my honor, I will marry her. Leopold's response was furious. You have been bewitched by some girl. Get yourself to Paris immediately. Wolfgang obeyed. Reluctantly, resentfully, but he obeyed. He went to Paris with his mother. He failed to find opportunities. His mother died, and when he finally returned, more than a year later, everything had changed. Aloysia had become successful in his absence. She had secured a position at the Munich court. She had risen while he had stagnated, and when he presented himself to her, certain that she had been waiting, certain that their love had survived, she rejected him. The scene has become legendary. Wolfgang arrived at her residence in his finest clothes, expecting reunion. Wolfgang. She barely looked at him. Aloysia, I have returned. So I see. I thought after all this time. You thought wrong. He stood frozen for a moment. Then he walked to the keyboard, sat down, and began to play. The song he chose required no interpretation. I gladly leave the girl who does not want me. Then he stood up and walked out. What he did next would have consequences for the rest of his life. He did not abandon the Weber family. He returned to them. He spent time in their household. But his attention shifted. There was another Weber daughter, a third sister, not as beautiful as Aloysia, not as talented, but she was there, and she was kind. Her name was Constanze. Constanze Weber was born in 1762, 6 years younger than her sister. She had grown up in Aloysia's shadow, always the lesser sibling. When the young composer began frequenting the Weber household again, she was 19 years old and unattached. Was Wolfgang genuinely in love with Constanze, or was she merely consolation after Aloysia's rejection? Did he transfer his feelings from one sister to another, or did he discover something in Constanze that her more glamorous sibling lacked? His messages to her suggest genuine affection. My angel, my all, my very self, he wrote. I kiss you 1,000,000 times. But messages can be performances. The heart's true contents are harder to verify. What is certain is that the relationship provoked scandal before it led to marriage. Wolfgang and Constanze began living together before they were wed. In 18th century Vienna, this was not merely improper, it was dangerous. The mother of the Weber sisters, Cecilia Weber, was a domineering woman who saw opportunity in her daughter's situation. She threatened to report Wolfgang to the police for shameful cohabitation. The threat was not idle. Legal consequences were possible. A young woman's reputation, once ruined, could not be restored. Under this pressure, Wolfgang signed a marriage contract. The terms were remarkable. He promised to pay 300 gulden per year if he failed to marry Constanze within 3 years. He also agreed to grant her a divorce if she requested one, an extraordinary provision for the era. What happened next depends on which account you believe. According to Wolfgang's version, Constanze took the contract and tore it up. "Dear Mozart," she said, "I need no written assurance from you. I trust your word alone." It was either a gesture of profound trust or a calculated performance designed to make the marriage inevitable. Perhaps it was both. Leopold received news of his son's intentions with fury. The Weber family was beneath them. Constanze was not worthy. Wolfgang was ruining his life. The wedding took place on August 4th, 1782, in St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna. Leopold did not attend. His written blessing arrived by post the following day, too late for the ceremony. Whether this timing was deliberate has never been determined. Either interpretation reflects poorly on the relationship. The marriage lasted 9 years, until Wolfgang's death. It produced 6 children. Only 2 survived infancy. Was it a happy marriage? The evidence is mixed. Wolfgang's messages to Constanze are affectionate, playful, sometimes explicitly romantic. He missed her when they were apart. He wrote constantly. He called her by pet names that suggest genuine intimacy. But there were problems. Money was always a problem. In his best years, Wolfgang earned substantial sums. At his peak, more than many noblemen spent annually. This should have been enough for a comfortable life. Yet he was perpetually in debt. Where did the money go? Some blame Wolfgang himself. He loved fine clothes. He kept servants. He played billiards for hours, often for money. He may have gambled at cards. He was completely incapable of financial planning. Others blame Constanze. She made frequent trips to Baden, a spa town, supposedly for her health. These trips were expensive. She bore 6 children in 9 years, and pregnancies were costly. Still others blame the system itself. There was no copyright protection in the 18th century. Once a piece was published, anyone could copy it, perform it, sell it. Wolfgang received a one-time payment for each composition and nothing afterward, no matter how many times it was performed. The truth probably encompasses all these factors. He earned like an aristocrat and spent like one, but without the inherited wealth that made such spending sustainable. The symptoms were unmistakable. Wolfgang wrote desperate messages to Michael Puchberg, a wealthy merchant and fellow Freemason, begging for loans. 21 such messages survive, spanning 3 years, each more desperate than the last. God, I am in a situation that I would not wish on my worst enemy. If you, my best friend and brother, abandon me, I am lost, unhappily and innocently lost, along with my poor sick wife and child. Puchberg lent money repeatedly. The loans were never fully repaid. The 6 pregnancies took their toll. The children arrived with exhausting regularity. Raymond in 1783, Carl Thomas in 1784, Johann in 1786, Teresa in 1787, Anna in 1789, Franz Xaver in 1791. 6 children in 9 years. For died in infancy. Raymond lived 2 months. Johann lived 1 month. Teresa lived 6 months. Anna died within an hour of her birth. For small coffins carried out of their various apartments in Vienna. The grief must have been overwhelming, even in an era when childhood mortality was grimly common. Every family knew loss. But knowing that death was common did not make it easier to bear. Wolfgang's messages from this period are strangely silent about these losses. He mentions the births. He mentions the deaths. But he does not dwell on them, does not describe his feelings. Whether this represents emotional suppression or cultural expectations about male stoicism, we cannot know. The household was under constant stress. Constanze was perpetually pregnant or recovering. Wolfgang was perpetually working, trying to earn enough to cover debts that kept multiplying. The babies kept coming. The money kept disappearing. Meanwhile, the wider world was not standing still. The musical establishment of Vienna was engaged in its own intrigues, and at the center of the most enduring controversy stood an Italian composer whose name would become synonymous with villainy, however unfairly. Antonio Salieri arrived in Vienna in 1766, a decade before Wolfgang took up residence there. He was Italian, talented, politically astute, and spectacularly successful. By the time the younger man arrived, Salieri was already established as the imperial court composer, a position of enormous prestige. The two men were inevitably rivals. They competed for the same commissions, the same performances, the same imperial favor. The Italian musical faction at court was powerful, and Salieri was its leading figure. Wolfgang, as a German-speaking composer trying to establish Italian opera, was the outsider. Did Salieri sabotage his rival's career? Wolfgang certainly believed so at times. Salieri and his followers will do everything they can to block me, he wrote in 1781. The messages contain repeated references to cabals and conspiracies, but his opinions were not consistent. In 1789, after attending a performance of Salieri's opera, he wrote with apparent sincerity, "I must admit, it is very good." The relationship seems to have fluctuated between paranoid suspicion and professional respect. The legend that has come down to us of Salieri as murderer, as poisoner, as the villain who destroyed his rival out of envy, is almost entirely fictional. It was created decades after both men were dead. Pushkin's play Mozart and Salieri in 1830 gave it literary prestige. Rimsky-Korsakov's opera gave it musical form. The 1984 film Amadeus gave it global visibility. None of it is true. Salieri did not poison Mozart. The symptoms of the final illness are inconsistent with arsenic poisoning. Modern medical analysis has repeatedly debunked the theory. More remarkably, Salieri was present at Wolfgang's funeral service. He continued to conduct performances of his rival's works after the death, and he taught Wolfgang's younger son, Franz Xaver, who became a musician himself. These are not the actions of a murderer. The legend persists because it makes a better story. A great artist cut down at 35 demands explanation. Natural illness is unsatisfying. A villain is dramatically necessary. Salieri was available, foreign, successful, a survivor. The real Salieri deserves better. He was a skilled composer, a respected teacher who trained the next generation, including Beethoven, Schubert, and Liszt. He was not a saint. He was not a villain. He was a professional who has been punished for 2 centuries for a crime he did not commit. But before the death, before the myths, there was a breaking point, a moment when Wolfgang stopped being a servant and became something new. In 1781, the rupture came. Archbishop Hieronymus von Colloredo had been Wolfgang's employer in Salzburg for nearly a decade. He was a reformer, a rationalist, and a man who treated musicians as servants. This was not unusual for the era. Court musicians occupied a peculiar position. educated enough to mix with aristocrats, talented enough to be celebrated, yet legally bound to their patrons like household staff. They wore livery. They ate with servants. They could be dismissed at will. Wolfgang had grown up under this system, but he had also performed for emperors across Europe. He had been celebrated in courts where Colloredo would have been received as a minor provincial dignitary. The contradiction was unbearable. He was famous throughout the continent, yet in his own hometown he was expected to bow and scrape before a man he considered his inferior. The conflict simmered for years. Colloredo denied
Wolfgang permission to travel. He demanded his presence at inconvenient times. He paid him poorly and valued him less. In 1781, Wolfgang was in Vienna, having accompanied the archbishop's entourage to the capital. He saw opportunity everywhere. Patrons who appreciated him, audiences who would pay. He wanted to stay. Colloredo wanted him to return. The young man requested permission to remain. Denied. He requested again. Denied again. The exchanges grew heated. On June 9th, Wolfgang presented himself at the archbishop's residence for what he hoped would be final negotiation. Instead of meeting with Colloredo, he was received by Count Karl Arco, the chief steward. According to Wolfgang's account, Arco physically expelled him. So this distinguished personage threw me out the door with a kick to my behind, he wrote to his father. That, then, is how they treat you in Salzburg, those who have devoted years of service. The kick became symbolic. The old order had literally kicked him out. He was free. He was also unemployed, with no guaranteed income, no patron, and no clear path forward. What he had done was unprecedented. Major composers did not simply quit their positions and strike out alone. The freelance musician was not yet a recognized profession. Wolfgang was inventing a new way of being an artist. Leopold was horrified. His son had thrown away security for uncertainty. He had insulted a powerful man. He had acted on impulse, on pride. Father and son would never fully reconcile. The breach that opened over career decisions, over Constanze, over fundamental questions of how life should be lived. It remained open until Leopold's death in 1787. The break with Colloredo, however, proved to be the making of Wolfgang's mature career. Vienna embraced him. He gave concerts, taught pupils, received commissions. The years immediately following were among the most successful of his life. He had been right to trust himself, but the triumph would not last forever. The most productive artistic collaboration of Wolfgang's career was with a man who could not be trusted about anything else. Lorenzo da Ponte was born Emanuele Conegliano in 1749. He converted to Catholicism, became a priest, was expelled from Venice for adultery and other scandalous behavior, and eventually arrived in Vienna to reinvent himself as an opera librettist. He was, by most accounts, a charming scoundrel. His memoirs, written decades later, are filled with self-aggrandizement and probable fabrication. He claimed credit for successes, minimized failures, and presented himself as the hero of every story. But he was extraordinarily good at his job. Da Ponte wrote the librettos for three of Wolfgang's greatest operas: The Marriage of Figaro in 1786, Don Giovanni in 1787, and Così fan tutte in 1790. These collaborations produced works that remain central to the repertoire more than 2 centuries later. Their first meeting likely occurred in a Viennese salon, though De Ponte's account cannot be fully trusted. What we know is that by 1785, they were working together on what would become the Marriage of Figaro. The source material was explosive. Beaumarchais' play had been banned throughout much of Europe as subversive. It mocked the aristocracy. It gave dignity to servants. It suggested that noble birth was no guarantee of noble character. Emperor Joseph II had specifically forbidden its performance in Vienna. De Ponte somehow convinced the emperor that an opera based on the play would be acceptable. The political satire would be softened, he promised. The most dangerous passages would be removed. Entertainment would triumph over ideology. He was not entirely honest. The opera that resulted retained much of the original's bite. Servants outsmart masters. A count's predatory behavior is exposed and mocked. Noble birth is shown to guarantee nothing. The premiere in May of 1786 was a sensation. Audiences demanded encores of so many numbers that the performance ran far longer than scheduled. Conservative critics were outraged. Progressive audiences were delighted. Wolfgang and De Ponte had created something new, an opera that was simultaneously popular entertainment and social commentary. Don Giovanni followed in 1787, premiered in Prague rather than Vienna. It was darker, stranger, more morally ambiguous. The title character is a seducer and killer who refuses to repent and is dragged to hell. Yet he is also charming, vital, more alive than the respectable characters around him. The opera refuses easy judgments. It is funny and terrifying, often simultaneously. Wolfgang was working on Don Giovanni when news arrived that his father had died in Salzburg. Leopold passed away in May of 1787. The reconciliation that both men probably wanted had never occurred. Some scholars hear echoes of this loss in the opera's final scene, when the stone guest arrives to pass judgment, when the father figure returns from beyond the grave. The son refuses to submit. Damnation follows. This interpretation may be too neat. Art does not map directly onto biography, but Don Giovanni was composed in the shadow of Leopold's death, and the opera's treatment of authority and rebellion cannot be entirely coincidental. Così fan tutte, their final collaboration in 1790, is perhaps the most disturbing of the three. Two men make a bet that their fiancées can be seduced. They disguise themselves and set out to prove that all women are faithless. The women resist, then yield. The men are triumphant, then appalled by their own success. Nobody emerges well. The opera has been called cynical, misogynistic, profound, and shallow. It may be all of these things. After Wolfgang's death, De Ponte's career declined. He fled Vienna amid scandal, wandered through Europe, and eventually emigrated to America. He became a grocer, a failed businessman, and eventually the first professor of Italian literature at Columbia College in New York. He died in 1838, having outlived his greatest collaborator by nearly half a century. The operas survive. The partnership that created them remains mysterious. Two men of dubious character, one a financial disaster, the other a moral one, somehow produced works of enduring beauty. On December 14, 1784, Wolfgang underwent an initiation ceremony that would shape the final years of his life. He became a Freemason. The Lodge of Beneficence welcomed him that winter evening. Within months, He had risen through the degrees, achieving the rank of Master Mason with unusual speed. His father Leopold followed him into the craft the following year, one of the few instances when the son led and the father followed. Freemasonry in the late 18th century was not the secretive conspiracy that later imaginations would conjure. It was a social movement, popular among intellectuals, artists, and progressive aristocrats. Its ideals, reason, tolerance, brotherhood, the moral improvement of humanity, aligned with Enlightenment philosophy. Its rituals provided structure and meaning. Its networks provided connections and support. For Wolfgang, the lodge offered something he desperately needed: community. The Masons he met were educated men who appreciated his music and his mind. They were potential patrons, collaborators, friends. The lodge was a space where social rank mattered less than shared values, where a musician could interact with nobles as something approaching an equal. He composed extensively for Masonic purposes, cantatas for lodge ceremonies, music for the investiture of new members, a Masonic funeral march that would later take on personal resonance. The symbolism of Freemasonry permeated his thinking and eventually found its fullest expression on the operatic stage. The Magic Flute, premiered in September of 1791, is saturated with Masonic imagery. The number 3, sacred to the craft, appears constantly. 3 chords open the overture. 3 ladies serve the queen of the night. 3 boys guide the hero through his trials. The temple where the hero is tested resembles a Masonic lodge. The themes of enlightenment triumphing over darkness, of wisdom gained through ordeal, of brotherhood transcending social distinction. These were Masonic values presented to popular audiences. Later conspiracy theorists would claim that Wolfgang was murdered by the Masons for revealing their secrets in this opera. The theory is absurd. The Magic Flute was propaganda for Freemasonry, not an exposé of it. Emanuel Schikaneder, who wrote the libretto, was himself a Mason. If the Brotherhood had wanted to punish betrayal, Schikaneder would have been equally guilty. He lived until 1812. The lodge supported Wolfgang during his financial crises. Michael Puchberg, who received those desperate begging messages, responded with generosity. When Wolfgang died, the Masons organized memorial events. They celebrated him as one of their own. The connection was genuine, meaningful, and ultimately benevolent. But 1791 was approaching, the year that would be his last, the year of impossible productivity and mounting anxiety, the year of triumph and mysterious commissions and gathering darkness. He had less than 12 months to live. 1791 began with lawsuits and ended with a funeral. The legal troubles came early. Prince Karl Lichnowsky, an aristocrat who had been Wolfgang's patron, went to court to recover a debt of 1,435 gulden. It was an enormous sum, roughly equivalent to 2 years' income for a skilled craftsman. The court ruled in the prince's favor. Wolfgang's wages were to be garnished until the debt was repaid. The reason for the debt remains unclear. Perhaps it was a loan for a journey to Berlin. Perhaps it covered some scandal that was never recorded. The documents do not tell us. What they do tell us is that the year of his death began with public humiliation, a court judgment against him. His income ceased, and yet the music kept coming. The creativity seemed to accelerate as everything else collapsed. The Piano Concerto No. 27 appeared in January, the last he would ever write. The Clarinet Concerto followed in October, a work of autumnal beauty that seems to know it is saying farewell. The opera The Clemency of Titus was commissioned for the coronation of Emperor Leopold II in Prague and completed under impossible deadline pressure. Ave Verum Corpus, a small choral work, achieved a perfection out of proportion to its modest scale. And then there was the magic flute. The commission came from Emanuel Schikaneder, actor, impresario, fellow mason, and proprietor of a theater in the Viennese suburbs. He wanted a German-language opera, something popular and accessible, with spectacle and comedy and magic. Wolfgang took this material and transformed it. The Queen of the Night's coloratura arias are superhuman in their difficulty. Papagino's simple songs are irresistibly charming. The trials in the temple achieve genuine solemnity. The finale became one of the most beloved moments in operatic history. The premiere on September 30th was a success that grew with each performance. Audiences returned again and again. The opera ran continuously for months. Wolfgang attended whenever he could. He reported the audience reactions to Constanze and messages, noting which numbers received the most applause, which jokes got the biggest laughs. Even as his health began to fail, he found energy and joy in watching his creation connect with ordinary people. But alongside the magic flute, another commission was consuming his attention, a commission that seemed to come from beyond the grave. In the summer of 1791, a stranger appeared at Wolfgang's door. He was tall, thin, dressed in gray. He did not give his name. He carried a commission for a requiem mass, a piece of music for the dead. The terms were unusual. The patron wished to remain anonymous. Payment would be generous. The composer was to ask no questions about who was commissioning the work or why. Wolfgang accepted. He had debts to pay, a family to support. A well-paying commission was not something to refuse. But the commission troubled him. The anonymity felt ominous. A requiem was music for death, and here it came delivered by an apparition in gray who refused to identify himself. Wolfgang began to believe, or to fear, that he was writing his own funeral music. Modern scholarship has solved the mystery he never could. The commissioner was Count Franz von Walsegg-Stuppach, an amateur musician whose young wife had recently died. The Count had a peculiar hobby. He commissioned works from professionals and passed them off as his own creations. The anonymity was simply his standard practice. But Wolfgang knew none of this. He knew only that a gray stranger had asked him to write a mass for the dead, and that his own health was deteriorating, and that the music he was creating seemed addressed to himself. The requiem became an obsession. Even as other commissions came and went, even as the magic flute continued its successful run, Wolfgang returned to it. He worked on it in bed when he was too weak to sit at the keyboard. To Constanze, he confided his fears directly. "I am writing this requiem for myself." Something was wrong with him. He did not know what, and he believed he would not live to complete the work. The physical decline had been gradual at first. Headaches, fatigue, swelling in his hands and feet. But by November, the symptoms accelerated. On November 20th, he took to his bed and did not rise again. The doctors came. Vienna's best physicians attended him, Dr. Thomas Franz Clauset and Dr. Matthias von Salaba. They examined him. They consulted. They did what 18th century medicine could do, which was not much. They bled him. This was standard treatment, based on the ancient theory that disease resulted from imbalance in bodily fluids. The bleeding likely weakened him further. Modern medicine would consider it actively harmful. The symptoms worsened. Fever, severe swelling. His body became so bloated he could barely move. Pain in his joints. Vomiting. A rash appeared on his skin. Wolfgang himself believed he had been poisoned. He said so to Constanze and to others. The mysterious commission, the gray stranger, the music for the dead, it all seemed to point toward malevolent design. This belief has fueled conspiracy theories ever since. But medical analysis does not support it. The symptoms are not consistent with arsenic or other common poisons. They match several natural diseases: rheumatic fever, streptococcal infection, kidney failure. A streptococcal epidemic was present in Vienna during the winter of 1791. Other patients showed similar symptoms. Other deaths occurred. Wolfgang may simply have been one victim among many. On the evening of December 4th, he asked to have the requiem score brought to his bed. A small group gathered: Constanze, her sister Sophie, a few close friends. They sang through sections of the unfinished work together. When they reached the lacrimosa, the tears, the mourning, the day of judgment, Wolfgang began to cry. He knew he would not finish it. He knew these were the last notes he would ever write. That evening, his condition worsened. He slipped in and out of consciousness. Those at his bedside reported that his hands moved slightly, as if conducting music no one else could hear. At 55 minutes past midnight on December 5th, 1791, he stopped breathing. The hands fell still. The music in his mind fell silent. He was 35 years old. The funeral that followed has been misrepresented for 2 centuries. The legend says Wolfgang was buried in a pauper's grave, tossed into a pit with strangers, his final resting place unmarked and forgotten. The legend says no one attended, that his body was carried to the cemetery in a storm. Almost none of this is true. The funeral service was held at St. Stephen's Cathedral on December 6th. Mourners attended, including Antonio Salieri, the man later accused of murdering him. The burial was in a common grave, yes, but this was not a mark of poverty or disgrace. Emperor Joseph II had reformed burial practices years earlier, mandating simpler funerals for everyone not of noble birth. Elaborate tombs and permanent markers were forbidden for ordinary citizens. Wolfgang was buried according to the law, not according to his means. The family did not accompany the coffin to the cemetery. This too was standard practice. Viennese custom held that mourners remained at the church while the body was transported. Constanze was following convention, not displaying indifference. The grave was lost because records were not kept carefully, because cemetery practices allowed graves to be reused, and because no one thought to mark the location permanently. By the time his fame had grown to the point where pilgrims wanted to visit, the exact site had been forgotten. It is a melancholy ending, but it is not the disgraceful ending that legend has constructed. He was buried as his peers were buried, mourned as his contemporaries were mourned. The tragedy lies in his early death, not in its aftermath. The music he left behind, more than 600 compositions, including some of the greatest works in Western culture, would guarantee his immortality. But on that December morning, As his body was carried through the streets of Vienna to a grave that would soon be lost, immortality must have seemed very far away. He was survived by a widow and two small sons. He was survived by debts that would take years to pay. He was survived by an unfinished requiem that would be completed by his students and performed in his memory. And he was survived by questions that have never been answered. Why did he die so young? What was in the correspondence that Constanze burned? What secrets went with him to that unmarked grave? The man was gone. The myth was just beginning. Constanze Mozart was 29 years old when she became a widow. She had two surviving sons, aged 7 and 4 months. She had debts that seemed insurmountable. She had an unfinished requiem that a mysterious patron was expecting. She had a household to maintain, creditors to satisfy, and a future that looked impossibly bleak. She also had something else: the accumulated manuscripts, documents, and correspondence of one of the most celebrated composers in European history. In the hands of a less capable woman, this inheritance might have been squandered, sold off piecemeal, scattered among collectors, lost to history. Constanze did something different. She turned her husband's legacy into a career. Her first crisis was the Requiem. The gray stranger's patron, still anonymous, still waiting, expected a completed work. Wolfgang had left behind substantial portions, but much remained unfinished. The Lacrimosa broke off after only 8 bars. Other movements existed only as sketches. Constanze turned to Franz Xaver Sussmayr, one of Wolfgang's students who had worked closely with him during the final months. Sussmayr completed the Requiem based on his teacher's sketches, his own knowledge of the style, and perhaps verbal instructions Wolfgang had given while dying. The result was delivered to the patron. The fee was collected. The widow had survived her first test. But Sussmayr's involvement created complications that persist to this day. Which parts are genuinely Wolfgang's work? Which are interpolations? The collaboration was never clearly documented. Some passages that audiences find most moving may not have been written by the man whose name appears on the score. The Requiem was only the beginning. Constanze organized memorial concerts across Europe. She negotiated with publishers for rights to her husband's works. She sold manuscripts carefully, maximizing their value rather than accepting whatever price was first offered. She collaborated with biographers, shaping the narrative for posterity. This collaboration was not passive. Constanze controlled access to documents. She decided which correspondence would be shared with researchers and which would remain private. She edited the story, emphasizing some elements while suppressing others. The pages she burned in the days after Wolfgang's death were only the beginning. Throughout her long widowhood, she continued to curate the archive, deciding what future generations would know. What was she hiding? The crude humor might have been one concern, the jokes that would have scandalized respectable society. References to debts and financial desperation might have been another. Perhaps there were romantic indiscretions, conflicts with family members, professional disputes. We cannot know. The pages are ash. The secrets died with her. In 1809, Constanze remarried. Her second husband was George Nicolaus Niesen, a Danish diplomat posted to Vienna. He was stable, respectable, devoted to her. He was also devoted to Wolfgang's memory, spending years working on a comprehensive biography. Some contemporaries criticized Constanze for remarrying. A widow of a great man was expected to spend her life in mourning. But she had been a widow for 18 years. She had raised 2 sons alone. She had built a career from her husband's legacy. She was 53 years old, and she deserved whatever happiness the marriage brought. Nissen died in 1826. Constanze survived him by another 16 years, passing away in Salzburg in 1842 at the age of 80. She had outlived Wolfgang by more than half a century. In her final years, she was a living monument, the last person who had known him intimately. Visitors came as pilgrims, hoping to touch some remnant of brilliance through proximity to his widow. What did she tell them? She spoke of his kindness, his humor, his devotion to family. She spoke of his endless capacity for work. She defended him against accusations of recklessness, insisting that his deaths were the product of bad luck rather than bad character. She did not speak of everything. The crude correspondence, the financial desperation, the conflicts with his father. These subjects she approached carefully or avoided entirely. She had spent a lifetime building a legacy. She was not going to undermine it in her final years. The sons she raised in Wolfgang's shadow carried that shadow throughout their lives. Carl Thomas Mozart was born in 1784, the second of 6 children and the first to survive infancy. He was 7 when his father died, old enough to have memories, too young to have known the man fully. He did not become a musician. The decision must have felt both like relief and like failure. How could anyone compete with Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart? How could a son hope to match a father whose works were already performed across Europe? Carl Thomas chose a different path. He became a civil servant, working as an accountant in Milan. He lived quietly, unmarried, avoiding the spotlight that would have illuminated his inadequacy. He died in 1858, 67 years after his father. He left no children. That branch of the family line ended with him. Franz Xaver Wolfgang Mozart had an even more complicated inheritance. He was born in July of 1791, just 4 months before Wolfgang's death. He never knew his father, never heard his voice, never felt his touch, never experienced his presence as anything other than absence. Yet Franz Xaver was raised to be his father's successor. Constanze saw to that. From earliest childhood, he was trained in music, pushed toward composition, positioned as the heir. He showed talent. He worked hard. He performed throughout Europe, always introduced as the son of the great Mozart. He even changed his name. He was baptized Franz Xaver, but he performed as Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart the Younger. The name opened doors that would have remained closed otherwise. It also ensured that every piece he wrote would be compared to his father's and found wanting. The comparisons were inevitable and devastating. Franz Xaver was a competent composer, perhaps even good by the standards of his time. But his father had been transcendent. Every review, every audience response reminded him that competent was not enough. He died in 1844 at 53 in Carlsbad. He never married. He left no children. Like his brother, he ended his branch of the family line. The direct descendants of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart survived for exactly 1 generation beyond the great man himself. There is melancholy symmetry in this. Wolfgang had poured everything into his music, leaving little for anything else. His sons received his name and his legacy, but not his capacity for the kind of creation that makes genetic continuation feel secondary. The music survived. The bloodline did not. A stranger detail shadows Franz Xaver's biography. He was born approximately 5 months after Wolfgang returned from a lengthy trip. The timing allowed mathematicians and gossips to calculate that conception might have occurred during his absence. Rumors circulated that Franz Xaver's true father was Susmer, the same student who later completed the Requiem, the same young man who spent so much time in the household. The rumor was never substantiated. Constanze never addressed it. Franz Xaver lived his entire life under a name that might not have been rightfully his. Probably the rumor was false. Probably it was just malicious gossip. But the uncertainty added one more shadow to a life already darkened by impossible expectations. The transformation of Wolfgang from celebrated contemporary to immortal icon occurred gradually over decades. In the immediate aftermath of his death, he was mourned as a significant loss, but not yet recognized as the towering figure he would become. Other composers were equally famous. The judgments of history had not yet rendered their verdict. The first phase of mythologization began in the early 19th century, as Romanticism reshaped European culture's understanding of artistic creation. The Romantics were drawn to his story, the prodigy, the suffering artist, the early death. They saw a prototype of the divine creator, touched by heaven, too pure for this corrupt world. The crude jokes disappeared from biographical accounts. The debts were attributed to impractical unworldliness. The man became a saint. This sanitized version dominated public perception for nearly a century. Concert programs presented him as ethereal, almost disembodied, a vessel through which divine music had flowed. The 20th century brought complication. Scholars gained access to complete correspondence, including passages that earlier editors had removed. The crude humor was revealed. The financial desperation was documented. The conflicts were examined. The saint became, once again, a human being. This humanization was not universally welcomed. Many people preferred the myth. They did not want to know that the creator of the Jupiter Symphony had written songs about bodily functions. They had built their relationship with the music on idealization, and they resented disturbance. But the human version proved more interesting than the saintly one. The contradictions made him real. The struggles made his achievements more impressive. A man who could write the Requiem while dying in debt, convinced he had been poisoned, wrestling with failing health. That man was more remarkable than any angel. The film Amadeus in 1984 crystallized a new public image: brilliant, vulgar, childish, sublime. The portrayal was not historically accurate in its details, but it captured something true about the contradictions. This image, too, is incomplete. Wolfgang was not merely a collection of contradictions. He was a person who lived in a specific time and place, shaped by specific circumstances, making specific choices. To understand him fully would require traveling back to 18th century Salzburg and Vienna, inhabiting a mental world profoundly different from our own. We cannot do this. We can only approach him through what survived: the music, the correspondence, the accounts of contemporaries, and construct a picture honest about its limitations. The music itself remains the most direct communication we have from him. When the Jupiter Symphony unfolds its final movement, when Don Giovanni descends to hell, when the Requiem's lacrimosa breaks off after 8 bars. In these moments, we hear something authentic, not the whole person, but something genuine that passed from his mind through his hands onto paper and into the air we breathe. 230 years after his death, people still gather in concert halls to hear this music. They still weep at the clarinet concerto. They still laugh at Papageno. They still shudder when the stone guest arrives. Whatever else has been lost, the burned correspondence, the grave site, the exact details of the final illness, the music has survived intact. This is what immortality looks like. Not a preserved body, not a maintained tomb. A sound that passes from generation to generation, carrying something of its creator into futures he could never have imagined. Return now to where we began. Vienna, 1842. A small apartment in Salzburg. Constanze Mozart-Niesen, 80 years old, receiving yet another visitor who wants to know about the husband she lost half a century ago. What was he like? Truly, she has answered this question 1,000 times. She knows what they want to hear. The kind husband, the devoted father, the pure artist. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between visitors, she must have remembered differently. The crude jokes that made her laugh even as they shocked her. The arguments about money. The nights when he worked until dawn, lost in a world she could not enter. The children who died. The children who survived. The unfinished requiem. She had known him better than anyone, and she had spent 50 years deciding what of that knowledge to share. The correspondence she burned, what was in it? Perhaps nothing shocking at all. Perhaps simply private, intimate in ways that did not require scandal to justify their destruction. Perhaps a widow was entitled to keep some things for herself. Or perhaps there were revelations that would have complicated the mythology she was building. We will never know. She kept her secrets to the end. When she died in March of 1842, she was buried beside her second husband in Salzburg. A monument was later erected at the supposed site of Wolfgang's grave in Vienna, though no one knew exactly where his body lay. Her grave is visited occasionally. His monument is visited constantly. The asymmetry would not have surprised her. She had spent her life in his shadow, managing his legacy, answering for his choices. Death did not change this arrangement. It merely extended it into eternity. In the final accounting, what do we know about Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart that is certain? We know he was born in Salzburg on January 27, 1756, and died in Vienna on December 5, 1791. We know he was a child prodigy shaped by his father, a young man who struggled against rigid hierarchy, a mature artist who produced works of unprecedented brilliance while drowning in debt. We know he married Constanze Weber, fathered 6 children, and buried 4 of them. We know he broke with his employer in Salzburg and never fully reconciled with his father. We know he joined the Freemasons and believed in their ideals of brotherhood. We know he wrote more than 600 compositions that have been performed continuously for more than 2 centuries. We know he died young, in circumstances never fully explained, leaving behind an unfinished requiem and a legend that has only grown with time. Beyond these facts, we have interpretation, speculation, mythology. We have the correspondence that survived and the silence where the burned pages should be. We have the music, which tells us something true, but not everything. We have 2 centuries of scholarship, each generation finding what it needed to find. He was brilliant and flawed, crude and refined, careless and meticulous. He contained contradictions that have never been resolved into a single coherent picture. Perhaps they cannot be resolved. Perhaps the contradictions are the truth. The music suggests he knew things about human experience that most people never learn. The operas understand love and jealousy, loyalty and betrayal, with depth that seems beyond ordinary comprehension. The piano concertos chart emotional journeys of astonishing subtlety. Yet the man who created these works was also the man who wrote jokes about bodily functions, who could not manage his finances, who fought with his father and may or may not have been faithful to his wife. The brilliance and the mess were not separate people. They were the same person, inseparable, indivisible. Perhaps this is what immortality really means. Not the preservation of a sanitized image, but the survival of the full human being, flaws and all, contradictions and all, mysteries and all. The Wolfgang who endures is not a marble statue, but a living puzzle, as complex and frustrating and fascinating as any person who ever lived. His grave is lost. His correspondence is partly ash. His final thoughts are unknown. But his music fills concert halls around the world, 230 years after his death, and shows no sign of stopping. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything. If Constanze had not burned those pages, what would we know? Perhaps nothing that would change our understanding fundamentally. Perhaps only more jokes, more debts, more complaints. Or perhaps we would have learned something that transformed everything. A secret that explained the debts. A confession that revealed the true nature of relationships. A revelation that made sense of the final illness. We will never know. That is the point. That is what she understood when she fed those pages to the flames. Some things are not meant for posterity. Some things belong only to the people who live them. The silence where those pages should be is itself communication. It tells us that even the most documented lives contain gaps. It reminds us that the Wolfgang we know is not complete, only the version that survived the fire. And it leaves us with questions that can never be answered, which is, in the end, what keeps us coming back. The mystery is part of the attraction. The unknowability is part of the fascination. A Wolfgang we understood completely would be less interesting than one who still puzzles us after 2 centuries. He remains what he was in the beginning, a man who made sounds that changed everyone who heard them, and who left behind more questions than answers. The music is the answer to questions we have not yet learned to ask. The silence is the space where all our certainties dissolve. Listen to the Requiem. Hear the Lacrimosa break off after 8 bars. That interruption, that incompleteness, that silence where music should be. That is the truest portrait of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart we will ever have. Everything else is what we add to fill the void. The concert hall falls silent. The conductor raises his baton. The first notes sound. 3 solemn chords, the beginning of the magic flute. Somewhere in that music is a man who died more than 200 years ago. A man who was vulgar and sublime, irresponsible and dedicated, loved and rejected, celebrated and forgotten and remembered again. He is not a statue. He is not a saint. He is not a monster. He is something rarer and more precious. A human being who left something behind that matters. The music plays. The audience listens. And Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, who died in poverty in a cold December in Vienna, becomes immortal once again. This is not the end of his story. There is no end. Every performance is a continuation. Every listener becomes part of the narrative. Every interpretation adds another layer to a mystery that will never be solved. The pages are ash. The grave is lost. The man is gone. But the music remains. And that, in the end, is everything.